Is it even possible to win with bad teammates? If you're the jungler, then yes. But only if you do it right. In this video you'll learn the right strategy to carry your bad teammates. Chapter 1. Optimal Farming Method. Everyone knows the farming route for level 4, but what they don't know is how to properly farm afterwards. So let's analyze every source of gold to determine the best farming method. Let's begin with the sources that are farmable. The buffs grant around 120 gold, gold crab grants around 100 gold, and the common creeps grant around 85 gold. And then there's the last farmable source, which actually grants the most gold and is often overlooked by junglers. Minions, after 5 minutes. A minion wave will grant you around 220 gold after the 70% gold reduction for junglers is gone, which happens at the 5-minute mark. You can farm minions by checking for lanes that your teammates have forgotten, where you can clear the way for them. But what about objectives and kills? Let's start with objectives. Objectives such as turrets and turtles grant gold for the entire team, but you should only consider the gold you gain for yourself. The first turtle grants around 60 gold, and slightly increases for the next turtles. Outer turrets will grant you around 110 gold when destroyed, but there's also the energy shield before the 5-minute mark that grants gold. When alone, it'll grant around 150 to 200 gold depending on how much you push. Kills will grant you between 50 to around 400 gold, depending on the amount of deaths the enemy has or a kill bounty. With all these sources of gold, what priority should you farm them? For the farmable sources, the first priority are minions but only after 5 minutes. Second are buffs unless you're a Ling or Fanny, then you should prioritize the buffs first. Third is the gold crab, and fourth are common creeps. As for objectives and kills, they're the first priority if there are good opportunities. One more important thing you need to know is the flow of minion waves, so you can maximize your farming. Minions spawn every 30 seconds in the game, specifically at the 10th second and the 40th second of each minute. You can also look at your team's minion waves to predict the enemy wave's position. Use this information to figure out when you should leave or stay at a lane a bit longer. For example, in this clip, I cleared the wave, then proceeded to walk as I knew another wave was arriving soon due to the minion wave's flow. This allowed me to get additional gold, and it prevented the chance of enemy split push, and me from wasting time going back and forth. Chapter 2. Jungle Invasion. If you get invaded but your teammates are bad, you'll have to deal with it on your own. Here's how you should respond. First, let's begin with when the enemy invades at the start of the game. If there's a high chance of invasion when they have invading heroes such as Hylos, Natalia, or Hilda, then don't use your retribution. You should also pull it to this position, because it may prevent the enemy from invading. But if they still decide to invade, here are the two common scenarios and how you should respond to them. The first scenario is when the enemy roamer invades your first buff. If the enemy zones you too much and you don't have backup because your own roamer is babysitting gold lane, don't waste any time and abandon your buff. You should then try farming on the opposite side of the invasion. The second scenario is when the enemy jungler and roamer invade your second buff. Here you should stay back, and wait until the buff is getting low. Once the buff is low, approach closer and use both your skill and retribution at the same time to increase your chance of getting the buff. Now, if the enemy decides to invade you later in the game or continuously invades you, there are two options. The first option is that you can attempt to get the buff by retribution, but first ask yourself where the other enemies are, as they could be camping there. The second option is instead of trying to get your buff, go invade theirs. But do it with caution and don't get noticed by other enemies. After you take their buff, don't overstay there as enemies could be coming. You're in their territory, and you might even have to recall so you get out safely. Chapter 3. Solo Rotation. When it comes to rotation, your main tasks are still to gank and try taking the turrets because it opens up the map. But the way you approach it is different. You shouldn't depend on your allies when ganking, because they might not follow up. What you want to do instead is to gank an easy lane, which you can figure out by considering these three things. Number 1. Ganking criterias. You should only gank if the following criterias are met. 1. The enemy is overextending. 2. The enemy is low HP. And 3. The enemy's battle spell or skills are on cooldown. Number 2. Enemy hero. Some enemy heroes can be harder to gank than others because of their hero skills. An example on gold lane is Claude. He can easily escape with his teleport. On EXP lane is for example Xborg, who can be hard to kill due to his passive and escape with ultimate. Although the way to gank harder heroes is to consider their abilities. Swipe and pay attention to the map to see when an enemy has used their dashing skill. But even if the enemy has used it, they could still have flicker available, where you can force them to use it, then retreat afterwards. If you decide to gank, keep in mind their battle spell and don't be surprised by it. Number 3. Counter ganks. If the enemy counter ganks you, it means they'll try to stop you from ganking by rotating to the same lane. So avoid where other enemies could potentially be rotating to, because team-related situations would end terribly due to your bad teammates. That's why you should look for 1v1 or 2v1 on the opposite lane of where the enemies rotate. But when you see an enemy alone, always first ask yourself where the other enemies are, as they could be camping for you. If you've considered these 3 things, and notice that none of the lanes are easy to gank, then don't force your ganks but instead focus on farming, or cut the enemy's rotation where you camp them. Chapter 4. Correct decision making. Making the best decisions you possibly can is important if you want to win. Normally, you should be able to make a few mistakes without losing. But the truth is, with bad teammates, your decisions have to be correct most of the time. So to help you with making the correct decisions for your next games, let's start with a situation we often experience with bad teammates. We have a feeder, and in this game it is Layla with a final KDA score of 082. During the game, she tries to take the purple buff. She also abandons her lane and goes to the EXP lane, when she should defend her turret. At this moment most junglers would complain about her not defending, but this is where you adjust to the circumstances and look at it in a better way. Now you can clear the waves, which actually helps with your farm by a lot. Though you don't always have to clear the lane, if there are other important things to do, or things you can trade the turret with. In this clip I could have cleared and defended the turret, but I didn't, because I decided to trade the top turret for the mid turret, which was better because it opened up the map more. So when having a feeder in the early and mid game, all you can do is focus on yourself where you farm, while looking for opportunities for ganks and kills. You can take advantage of your bad teammates by having them as a distraction for enemies, rather than you engaging first. But this is a risky move, because if you enter the teamfight too late, there's a chance of you being the only one left, where your teammates are already dead. But what about a situation in the late game, with only your inhibitor turrets left, and the enemy team is preparing for Lord? As the jungler, you have to decide whether to try and steal the Lord, or stay to defend. Here's what I would recommend. If it's a normal Lord, without the charge ability, you can try to defend. But if it's an enhanced Lord after 12 minutes, trying to steal the Lord might be the better choice, because otherwise you would have to defend their enhanced Lord. You can also figure out which decision is best, by looking at your own team and the enemies. Does your team have strong wave clear to defend? Strong defenders are heroes like Lilia, Beatrix, Xavier, Naten, Moskov, Lolita and marksman heroes. Also consider if the enemy team has a support rather than a tank, as it would be more difficult for them to end without a tank, because supports aren't as good engagers. If you want more jungler tips, here's a guide about the 7 secret tips for junglers during the early game.